So one of the biggest learning curves that I think new sourdough bakers tend to have is learning how to handle and work with the dough. So sourdough bread tends to be made with a much stickier style of dough, and this is because of the hydration level. So sourdough bread tends to be a much higher hydration than bread made with commercial yeast, and it takes a lot of practice to get used to how to handle this dough. This was something that took me a long time to get used to, and I had to make quite a few batches of sourdough to start feeling confident with it. So today I want to go through some of my best tips for how to work with this style of dough. And before we dive into that, I think it's important to note what hydration means. So hydration is referring to the amount of water that's in your dough compared to the amount of flour in your dough. And this is always represented as a baker's percentage. And if you're not familiar with baker's percentages, this is something you're really going to want to get familiar with when you are learning to make bread. And I have a full, really detailed video on that, which I will link in the description. So most home bakers are probably used to working with a dough that's somewhere in the 65% hydration range, or maybe even a little bit lower. And sourdough bread tends to start somewhere around the 70% hydration range and can go much higher than that. A lot of times it might be in the 80% range or even 90% range. So because of this, it's a much trickier dough to work with. So let's talk about some of my favorite tips for working with this dough. So my first tip in working with a higher hydration dough is to work your way up to it. If you're working with a recipe that's calling for something around 78% or 75% hydration, I suggest bringing that hydration down. You can just reduce the amount of water in your recipe and start somewhere around 65% or 68%. That is going to be much easier for you to work with and to start getting a feel for the dough. And then as you get more confident, you can increase that water and work your way up. My second tip in working with high hydration dough is to always utilize the Autolyse step. So Autolyse is when we mix our flour and water together without our starter and without our salt. And we let that sit for a little while before we mix in the rest of our ingredients. Now the benefit of this step is that it allows the flour to completely absorb the water, and it also gives us a jump start on our gluten formation. And this just makes working with the dough much easier when you go to mix in your starter and salt and start building up your gluten structure. So I typically let my Autolyse step go for about 30 minutes to 1 hour, but if you're working with a large quantity of whole grain flour, you might even want to let this step go for up to 2 hours. And when you look at your dough after you first mix this flour and water together, you will notice that as you pull it apart, there is absolutely no structure to it. It just rips immediately. But when you come back from letting the dough sit for about 30 minutes, you will see that it's so much stretchier and so much more extensible. And that is because we let time do some work for us, and that gluten structure is already starting to build. Tip number 3 is to use wet hands when you are building strength in your dough. So wet hands will not stick to wet dough. So whenever I am doing the process of stretch and folding my dough, I always have a little container of water beside my dough, and I'll go in and get my hand wet before I perform my round of stretch and folds. And this is going to make it much easier to build that strength in your dough and to not let the dough rip as you are doing this process of stretching and folding your dough. Tip number 4 is to learn how to read the strength in your dough rather than just going by what your recipe states. So a lot of times when you are following a sourdough recipe, it might tell you to do 4 rounds of stretch and folds, or maybe 5 rounds of stretch and folds. But you really need to get used to reading your dough and checking the strength on it, because sometimes you might need some additional rounds to build strength in your dough, especially for a higher hydration dough. So what you can do to check the strength of your dough is to do what is called the window pane test. So you're going to get your hands wet and you're going to pull up on a corner of the dough and stretch it as far as you can. And if it rips, then that is a really good indication that you need to build some more strength in your dough by doing a few more rounds of stretch and folds. If you are able to pull that dough apart really thin to where you can see light through it, that's a really good indication that you have a really strong gluten structure, and you're going to be able to shape your dough in a way where it will hold its shape. Tip number 5 when working with a high hydration dough is you want to make sure you are preserving as much air as you can when you go to shape your dough. So if you are used to working with a yeasted dough, you might be familiar with the process of punching down the dough after it has risen that first time to get all of the air out of it before you shape it. However, in sourdough bread, and especially in high hydration sourdough bread, we want to preserve that air that has been building up in it during that first rising phase. So as you go to turn it out of the bowl to shape it, you want to be really gentle with it so that you are preserving as much air as you can inside of the dough. Tip number 6 is when you start shaping your dough, you really want to make sure that you are only putting flour on the counter and on the side of the dough that is going to be on the outside of your loaf of bread, rather than flouring the top of your dough, which is going to be the inside of your bread. Because when you shape it, you want the top of the dough to remain really sticky so that it will stick to itself as you shape it and it will much better hold its shape. So make sure you're really only putting the flour on the table and that the part of the dough that's going to be shaped and on the inside is not touching that flour. So one of my favorite tips for working with a high hydration dough is to really utilize your bench knife to your advantage. And I kind of think of mine as an extension of my hand as I am shaping my dough. So I always hold it in my dominant hand and I really use it to help me tame the dough. And because it's metal, dough does not really tend to stick to the bench knife as much as it does your hands because your hands are much warmer. So that being said, you likely are still going to use your hands sometimes during the shaping process. And so I always instruct people to really think about letting the dough just sort of stick to your hand and move with your hand rather than really grabbing and squeezing the dough as you are shaping it. This took me a lot of practice and it's likely just going to take you a few times to get used to what this feels like, but just let the dough naturally stick to your hand and let it move with you as you are shaping. And with both of these tips and using your bench knife and letting the dough stick to your hands, you do really need to think about using quick and confident movements. The slower you are in manipulating your dough, the more it will stick to you. So you need to move quickly and confidently as you are manipulating it. Tip number 10 is to not skip over the pre-shaping step. So pre-shaping is when you really quickly shape your dough into roughly a rounded ball, and that is going to help configure the gluten structure in a way that will help it hold its shape better when you do your final shaping. So for higher hydration dough, this is a super beneficial step so that when you do your final shape, it is going to stand much taller and hold its shape much better. Now the next tip is when you go to do your final shaping. You really need to think about building a really nice strong tension on the outside of your dough as you do your final shaping so that it will stand nice and tall for you when you go to bake it. So really make sure that as you are doing your final shaping step, as you pull the dough to shape it into your round, or if you're doing a Betard and you're doing your stitching, you just wanna make sure that the outside of the dough feels like it has a really nice tension on it and that it is really going to hold its shape. And my final tip for working with a high hydration dough is to utilize the retardation step in the refrigerator before you turn your dough out of the Banneton basket and score it to go into the oven. If you are trying to score a room temperature dough that is really high hydration, it is very difficult. You're likely going to rip the dough and it likely is not going to hold its shape very well before it goes into the oven. So after you do your final shaping on your dough, I like to go ahead and put the dough in the refrigerator overnight, somewhere around 12 to 16 hours before I turn it out of the basket and before I go into the oven with it and score it. And that is going to firm the dough up much more. It's going to be much easier to score and it's going to hold its shape much better as you transfer it into your Dutch oven to bake. I hope these tips are helpful for you in working with your high hydration dough. Like I said in the beginning, a lot of it just takes practice. So be patient with yourself and you will get better as you make each new loaf. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down in the comment section. I do always try to answer them. And I have a really extensive sourdough for beginners playlist. If you are new to sourdough baking, I'll leave that linked below, and it can be really helpful for you to go through that whole playlist. I'll see you all next time with another recipe tutorial.